A poor girl tries to earn coins by washing cars on the street. A millionaire notices her colorful bracelet and recognizes something impossible to ignore. It was identical to the one he made for his sister, who disappeared 20 years ago. Without knowing it, the girl ends up changing the destiny of an entire family forever. The rain had just stopped falling over downtown Chicago, leaving the asphalt gleaming under the amber streetlights. It was past 8 in the evening when Marcus Thompson finally emerged from the glass tower that housed Thompson Industries, his leather briefcase heavy with contracts that needed reviewing before tomorrow's board meeting. At 32, Marcus had built an empire from nothing, transforming a small tech startup into one of the most successful software companies in the Midwest. But success had come at a price. His days began before dawn and ended well after sunset, leaving little room for anything beyond quarterly reports and profit margins. As Marcus walked toward his black Mercedes in the executive parking garage, he noticed a small figure crouched beside one of the cars near the entrance. The child couldn't have been more than 8 years old, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans that had seen better days and a faded pink sweater. She held a worn sponge in one hand and a plastic bottle filled with soapy water in the other, carefully washing the wheels of a silver sedan. Marcus paused, watching as the little girl worked with the kind of focused determination that reminded him of something from long ago, something he couldn't quite place. She moved methodically, making sure every inch of the chrome rim sparkled before moving on to the next wheel. There was something both heartbreaking and admirable about her dedication to the task, the way she took such pride in work that most adults would consider beneath them. When she stood up to wipe her forehead with the back of her hand, that's when Marcus saw it. Around her thin wrist was a bracelet made of colorful wooden beads, each one painted in bright primary colors and strung together with what looked like fishing line. The pattern was unmistakable. Red, blue, yellow, green, red, blue, yellow, green. A simple sequence that hit Marcus like a physical blow to the chest. His briefcase slipped from his suddenly numb fingers, hitting the concrete floor with a sharp crack that echoed through the parking garage. The sound startled the child, who looked up at him with wide brown eyes, her small hand instinctively moving to cover the bracelet as if protecting it from view. Marcus stood frozen, his mind racing back 20 years to a sunny afternoon in their backyard in suburban Indianapolis. He could see himself at 12 years old, sitting at the old picnic table with his 3-year-old sister Emma, carefully threading wooden beads onto fishing line while she clapped her tiny hands in delight. Red, blue, yellow, green, he had repeated, the pattern over and over, explaining to her that these were going to be her special colors, the ones that would keep her safe and remind her that her big brother loved her no matter what. 2 weeks after he gave her that bracelet, Emma had disappeared from their front yard while their mother was inside answering a phone call, just vanished as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The police searched for months, following every lead, questioning every neighbor, but Emma was never found. The case went cold, his parents' marriage crumbled under the weight of grief and blame, and Marcus had learned to bury the pain so deep that most days he could almost convince himself that Emma had been nothing more than a dream. But now, standing in this parking garage, staring at an impossible replica of the bracelet he had made with his own 12-year-old hands, Marcus felt 20 years of carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble. The child was still looking at him with a mixture of concern and wariness, probably wondering why this strange man in an expensive suit was staring at her like he'd seen a ghost. Marcus forced himself to take a slow breath, to approach her the way he might approach a frightened animal, his voice gentle despite the chaos raging in his mind. "Hi there," he said, crouching down to her eye level. "I'm Marcus. I noticed you're doing a really good job washing that car." The little girl relaxed slightly, though she kept her distance. "Thank you, sir. I try to make them really clean so people are happy." "What's your name?" "Sophie," she said, and then after a moment added, "Sophie Martinez." Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs. "That's a beautiful name. Sophie, can I ask you about your bracelet? It's really pretty." Sophie's hand moved protectively over the colorful beads again. "My mama gave it to me. She said it was special, That someone who loved her very much made it for her when she was little like me. The words hit Marcus like a second blow, this one even stronger than the first. Someone who loved her very much made it for her when she was little. The phrasing was so specific, so precise, that it couldn't be coincidence. His hands were shaking as he reached into his wallet and pulled out a $20 bill. "Sophie, how much do you usually charge to wash a car?" $5, sir, but I do a really good job. I clean the tires and everything." Marcus handed her the 20. "This is for washing my car, and because you do such excellent work. But can I ask you something? Where do you and your mama live?" Sophie pointed toward the street beyond the parking garage. "In the apartments on Maple Street, the brick ones with the green doors. Mama works a lot, so I help by washing cars after school. We need money for groceries and stuff." Marcus felt something shifting inside his chest, a combination of heartbreak and hope that he hadn't experienced in 2 decades. "Would it be okay if I drove you home? It's getting late and I don't like the idea of you walking by yourself." Sophie hesitated, clearly having been taught about strangers, but something in Marcus's eyes must have convinced her that he was safe. "Okay, but I have to bring my washing stuff." As they walked toward his Mercedes, Sophie chattering about school and her favorite teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, Marcus found himself studying her profile. There was something familiar about the way she tilted her head when she talked, the way she gestured with her hands, but it was more than that. If the bracelet belonged to Emma, if this child's mother was somehow his lost sister, then Sophie wasn't just any little girl asking for help. She was his niece. The apartment complex on Maple Street was a far cry from the luxury condos and suburban mansions where Marcus usually found himself. The brick buildings were old but well-maintained, with small patches of grass between the units and children's bicycles chained to the railings. Sophie led him up, a narrow staircase to apartment 2B, where she knocked on the door with a specific rhythm, 3 short taps followed by 2 long ones. The woman who opened the door was probably in her early 20s, with the same dark hair as Sophie, and eyes that held the weight of someone who had grown up too fast. She was beautiful in an understated way, but it was her expression of protective alertness that struck Marcus most. This was a mother who had learned to be constantly vigilant, to question every kindness, because experience had taught her that kindness often came with a price. "Sophie, honey, who is this?" she asked, pulling her daughter close while keeping her eyes on Marcus. "This is Marcus, Mama. He paid me $20 to wash his car, and he drove me home because it was getting dark." The woman, who introduced herself as Elena Martinez, studied Marcus with the same wariness her daughter had shown. But as Marcus explained about finding Sophie in the parking garage and wanting to make sure she got home safely, some of the tension in Elena's posture began to ease. "That was very kind of you," Elena said finally. "Sophie, go wash your hands for dinner." As Sophie disappeared into the small apartment, Elena stepped onto the hallway landing, closing the door behind her. "Look, I appreciate what you did, but I have to ask, why? People like you," she gestured at his expensive clothes, "don't usually notice people like us, and they definitely don't drive little girls home out of the kindness of their hearts." Marcus understood her suspicion. A wealthy stranger showing sudden interest in a poor child was exactly the kind of situation any good parent would question. But how could he explain about the bracelet without sounding completely insane? How could he tell this woman that he thought she might be his sister, lost for 20 years, based on nothing more than a piece of childhood jewelry and a gut feeling that defied all logic? "You're right to be cautious," he said finally. "I know how this looks, but the truth is, your daughter reminds me of someone I lost a long time ago. Someone very important to me." Eleanor's eyes narrowed slightly. "What do you mean, reminds you?" Marcus took a deep breath, knowing he was about to sound like either a lunatic or a liar. "Her bracelet, the one with the wooden beads. I made one exactly like that for my little sister when I was 12 years old. She disappeared shortly after, and I haven't seen anything like it since." The color drained from Elena's face. Her hand went instinctively to her throat, as if searching for something that wasn't there. "That's impossible," she whispered. But even as she said it, Marcus could see doubt creeping into her eyes. "Elena, I know how crazy this sounds, But can you tell me anything about where that bracelet came from? Anything at all?" Elena was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. "I've had it since I was little. My earliest memory is wearing it, but I don't remember who gave it to me. I was raised in foster care after they found me wandering alone in a parking lot in Indianapolis when I was 3. I had the bracelet and nothing else, not even a last name." Indianapolis, 3 years old, found alone. Marcus felt the world spinning around him, felt 20 years of grief and wondering crystallizing into a truth so enormous he could barely comprehend it. "Elena," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "what if I told you that my sister's name was Emma Thompson, and she disappeared from our front yard in Indianapolis in 2004 when she was 3 years old?" Elena stared at him, her breath coming in short gasps. "You're saying you think I'm your sister?" "I'm saying I think it's possible. The bracelet, the age, the place you were found, it all fits." They stood in the narrow hallway, two strangers connected by an impossible possibility, while somewhere behind the door Sophie sang softly to herself. As she washed her hands, the weight of 2 decades of separation hung between them, along with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, a little girl washing cars in a parking garage had just brought a family back together. The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of careful conversations, tentative hope and growing connections. Marcus found himself visiting Maple Street every evening after work, bringing groceries, homework supplies, and most importantly, time. He would sit on the small couch in Elena and Sophie's living room, helping Sophie with her math homework, while Elena watched from the kitchen doorway, still cautious but increasingly willing to believe in the possibility that this man might actually be the brother she had never known she'd lost. During these visits, Marcus began to notice things that made his heart ache with recognition. The way Elena tilted her head when she was thinking deeply, exactly like their mother used to do. How she unconsciously hummed while cooking, the same tuneless melody that had filled their childhood kitchen. Sophie's laugh, bright and infectious, that reminded him so powerfully of Emma's giggles from 20 years ago that sometimes he had to excuse himself to the bathroom, just to collect his emotions. Elena, meanwhile, found herself studying Marcus's face when he wasn't looking, searching for something she couldn't quite name. There was a warmth in his eyes when he looked at Sophie that felt achingly familiar, like an echo of something she had known long ago. Sometimes when he helped Sophie sound out difficult words, his patience and gentle encouragement triggered flashes of memory so brief she wondered if she was imagining them. A man's voice reading bedtime stories, strong arms lifting her high into the air, the feeling of absolute safety and love. Sophie seemed to sense the emotional undercurrents swirling around the adults, and in the way of children, she simply accepted Marcus's presence as a natural part of their lives. She began saving her best artwork from school to show him, and started asking Eleanor if Marcus could stay for dinner more often. Her teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, called Eleanor to comment on the remarkable change in her daughter's confidence and participation in class. "Sophie talks about her Uncle Marcus constantly," Mrs. Rodriguez said during their phone conversation. "She's like a different child, more outgoing, more willing to share. Whatever's happening in your family, it's wonderful to see." The neighbor who had been watching Marcus's visits with suspicious eyes was slowly warming up as well. Roberto Castillo, a widowed man in his 60s who had appointed himself as the unofficial protector of the single mothers in the building, had initially been deeply concerned about this wealthy stranger's sudden interest in Elena and Sophie. But as weeks passed and he observed Marcus's genuine care for the family, his wariness began to transform into grudging approval. "He's not what I expected," Roberto admitted to Elena one evening, as they watched Marcus teach Sophie how to properly dribble a basketball in the small courtyard behind their building. "Rich men don't usually have time for other people's children. This one is different." During one of these visits, on a rainy Thursday evening when Sophie was particularly proud of a math test she had aced, Marcus gently broached the subject that had been weighing on all their minds. "Elena, I think we should do a DNA test. I know it sounds clinical and cold, but it's the only way we'll know for certain." Elena had been expecting this conversation, but hearing the words still made her stomach clench with anxiety. She set down the dish towel she had been using and came to sit on the couch beside Marcus and Sophie. "What if the test comes back negative?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if this beautiful, impossible dream turns out to be exactly that, just a dream?" Marcus reached over and gently took her hand, careful not to startle her. "Then we'll deal with that when it happens. But Eleanor, whether or not we're biologically related, you and Sophie have become my family. That's not going to change regardless of what some lab report says." Sophie looked up from her coloring book, her crayon poised in midair. "What's a DNA test?" Elena struggled to find age-appropriate words to explain genetics to an 8-year-old. "It's a way doctors can tell if people are related to each other, like if they're really family." "But we're already family," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "Marcus comes to dinner and helps me with homework and brings us groceries. That's what families do." The simple wisdom of her daughter's words brought tears to Elena's eyes. But she knew they needed scientific confirmation, if only to put the wondering to rest. "Okay," she said, to Marcus. "Let's do the test." The process was simpler than either of them had expected. A quick swab inside the cheek, samples sent to a laboratory in downtown Chicago, and then the hardest part of all, waiting. The lab technician, a kind woman named Dr. Sarah Chen, had told them results would be available in 5 to 7 business days, but those days stretched like months. During the wait, something beautiful began to happen. Marcus found himself leaving work earlier, something his assistant Jennifer couldn't quite believe. The man who had spent the last 10 years practically living at the office was suddenly cutting meetings short and declining weekend conference calls. "Sir, the Peterson Industries merger can't wait until Monday," Jennifer protested when Marcus announced he was leaving at 5 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. "The Peterson Industries merger has been in negotiation for 6 months, Marcus replied, gathering his coat. "It can wait until I've had dinner with my family." Jennifer stared after him as he walked toward the elevator. In all the years she had worked for Marcus Thompson, she had never heard him use the word family in reference to his personal life. Sophie blossomed under the consistent attention and encouragement. Her reading level jumped dramatically as Marcus introduced her to chapter books, sitting beside her on the couch each evening and helping her work through words like extraordinary and magnificent. When she successfully read an entire page of Charlotte's Web without help, the pride on both their faces was identical. Eleanor found herself opening up in ways she hadn't since Sophie was born. She told Marcus about her years in foster care, how she had aged out of the system at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and fierce determination to create a better life. She spoke about the loneliness of not knowing where she came from, of making up stories about her parents to tell Sophie when the little girl asked about grandparents and family history. "I used to tell her that her grandparents were traveling the world, having adventures," Elena confessed one evening, as they watched Sophie sleep peacefully in her small bedroom. "I said they sent their love from faraway places because I couldn't bear to tell her that we didn't have anyone." Marcus shared his own stories about the guilt he had carried for not protecting Emma, about how their parents had divorced 2 years after the disappearance, each unable to look at the other without seeing their failure to keep their daughter safe. He told Elena about his father, David, who had moved to Florida and remarried, and about their mother, Carol, who had never remarried and still lived in the same house in Indianapolis, keeping Emma's room exactly as it had been the day she vanished. "She lights a candle for Emma every year on her birthday," Marcus explained, his voice thick with emotion. "September 15th, she's never stopped believing that someday Emma would come home." Eleanor's hand flew to her throat. "September 15th is my birthday. I mean the birthday the foster system assigned me when they couldn't find any records." Marcus stared at her, feeling another piece of the impossible puzzle click into place. "Elena, that's Emma's birthday. That's your real birthday." On the 6th day after submitting their samples, Marcus's phone rang while he was in the middle of a presentation to potential investors. He normally would never take a personal call during such an important meeting, but when he saw the lab's number on his screen, he excused himself without explanation, ignoring the surprised looks from his business partners. "Mr. Thompson, this is Dr. Sarah Chen from Chicago Genomics. I have your DNA comparison results. Marcus's heart hammered so hard he could barely hear her words. Yes? I'm calling to inform you that the test was inconclusive. We'll need to collect new samples and run the test again. The disappointment hit Marcus like a physical blow. He leaned against the wall of the conference room, struggling to process the words. Inconclusive? What does that mean? Sometimes samples can be contaminated or degraded during processing. It's not uncommon, though it is frustrating. We'll need both parties to come in again, and we'll prioritize the new test. There's no additional charge. Marcus found Elena waiting by her phone with the same desperate hope he had been carrying. When he told her about the inconclusive results, he watched the light fade from her eyes, saw her protective walls beginning to rebuild themselves. Maybe this is a sign, Elena said quietly, sinking onto her couch. Maybe we're just two people who want something to be true so badly that we're seeing connections that aren't really there. But Sophie, who had been listening from her spot on the living room floor where she was coloring, looked up with the wisdom that children sometimes possess. Mama, when I lost my tooth last month, you had to look in 3 different places before you found it under my pillow. Sometimes you have to look more than once to find something important. Roberto, who had come upstairs to check on them after seeing Marcus's devastated expression in the parking lot, nodded sagely. The girl is right. Important things are worth waiting for, worth trying again. The second test took another week. During those 7 days, Marcus surprised himself by how much he had come to need these evening visits, how empty his expensive downtown condo felt compared to the warmth of Elena and Sophie's small apartment. He realized that somewhere in the process of hoping Elena was his sister, she had become his family, regardless of what any test might reveal. The 3 of them fell into a routine that felt as natural as breathing. Marcus would arrive each evening around 6, usually carrying takeout from one of the better restaurants in downtown Chicago. They would have dinner together around the small table in Elena's kitchen, Sophie chattering about her day at school, while Elena and Marcus listened with the focused attention of people who understand how precious ordinary moments can be. After dinner, Marcus would help Sophie with her homework while Elena cleaned up, and then they would all settle in the living room. Sometimes they watched movies, sometimes Marcus read aloud from chapter books, and sometimes they just talked. Sophie would fall asleep curled up between them, and Marcus would carefully carry her to her bed while Elena turned down the covers. These moments of domestic tranquility were a revelation to Marcus, who had spent his adult life believing that success was measured in quarterly profits and market share. Watching Sophie's face light up when she mastered a difficult math problem, seeing Elena's tentative smile grow more confident each day, feeling the simple contentment of being needed and valued for something beyond his bank account, all of it was transforming him in ways he hadn't expected. When Dr. Chen called with the second set of results, Marcus was sitting on Elena's couch with Sophie curled up beside him, reading from The Secret Garden, while Eleanor graded papers at the kitchen table. She had started taking evening classes toward her GED, and Marcus had been quietly helping her with the algebra that gave her trouble. Marcus answered the phone on the first ring, his heart racing. Dr. Chen? Mr. Thompson, I have excellent news. The DNA analysis confirms a 99.7% probability that you and Elena Martinez share the same biological parents. She is definitely your sister. The phone slipped from Marcus's hands, clattering to the floor. Elena looked up from her papers, saw the expression on his face, and slowly stood up. Sophie stopped coloring and looked between the 2 adults with wide, concerned eyes. "What is it?" Elena whispered. Marcus tried to speak but found his voice had completely deserted him. He picked up the phone with trembling hands. "Dr. Chen, could you please repeat that? The test confirms that you and Elena are full siblings. There's no doubt." Elena's legs gave out and she sat down hard on her kitchen chair. She stared at Marcus across the small apartment. 23 years of wondering and searching and feeling incomplete finally resolved in a single phone call. Sophie looked from her mother to Marcus with wide eyes. "Does this mean Marcus is my uncle? Like my real uncle?" Through her tears, Eleanor nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. It means we have a family." The phone calls that followed were some of the most emotional of Marcus's life. First, he called his father in Florida, who broke down sobbing when Marcus told him that Emma was alive, that she was safe, that she had a beautiful daughter and had grown into a remarkable woman, despite everything she had endured. "I need to see her," David kept repeating through his tears. "I need to see my little girl. Can I fly up tomorrow? Can I come tomorrow?" Then came the call to their mother. Carol Thompson had been working in her garden when the phone rang, and Marcus could picture her wiping soil from her hands before answering, never imagining that her world was about to change forever. "Marcus, is everything okay? You sound strange." "Mom, you need to sit down. I have something to tell you about Emma." The silence that followed lasted so long that Marcus thought the call had been dropped. Then he heard his mother's voice, smaller and more fragile than he had ever heard it. Did you find... "She's alive, Mom. Emma is alive, and she's here with me. She has a daughter, and they're both safe, and she's coming home." Carol's sobs were audible through the phone, deep, wrenching sounds that came from 20 years of buried grief finally being released. "I knew it," she kept saying. "I knew she was out there somewhere. I could feel it. A mother knows." The reunion 3 days later at their childhood home in Indianapolis was something Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. Carol had spent those 3 days in a frenzy of preparation, cleaning Emma's room for the first time in 20 years, buying clothes and toys for Sophie, cooking enough food to feed an army. David had flown in from Florida and was waiting nervously in the living room, pacing from window to window. When Elena and Sophie walked through the front door of the house where Elena had lived for the first 3 years of her life, the world seemed to stop. Carol stood frozen in the hallway, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at the face she had been dreaming about for 2 decades. "Emma?" she whispered, and Elena felt something deep inside her chest crack open. "I think so," Elena replied, her voice shaking. "I think I might be." Carol took one look at her daughter's face and collapsed into the nearest chair, sobbing. "Oh my God! Oh my God! You're here! You're really here! My baby, my little baby, you came home!" Elena approached her mother tentatively, still struggling to fully accept this new reality. But when Carol reached out and touched her face with trembling fingers, tracing the features she had memorized from baby photos and dreams, something inside Elena broke open. All the years of wondering where she came from, all the nights she had stared at Sophie and wished she could give her daughter the family history she had never known herself, all of it dissolved in her mother's embrace. David emerged from the living room, moving slowly, as if afraid that any sudden movement might make this vision disappear. When he saw Elena's face, saw Emma's eyes in a grown woman's features, he let out a sound that was part sob, part laugh, part prayer of thanksgiving. "My little pumpkin," he said, using the nickname that Elena didn't remember, but that somehow felt exactly right. "Look how beautiful you are, look how strong and beautiful my little girl became." Sophie, initially overwhelmed by the intensity of adult emotions, clung to Marcus's hand until Carol noticed her standing quietly by the door. "And you must be Sophie," Carol said, kneeling down to the little girl's level despite her shaking knees. "I'm your grandmother. I've been waiting so long to meet you." Sophie studied Carol's face seriously. "Are you really my grandma? My mama said we didn't have any grandmas or grandpas." "We didn't know where you were, sweetheart, but we never stopped looking. And now you're here and I get to be your grandma for real." Carol showed Sophie around the house, pointing out photos of Elena as a baby, explaining who everyone was in the family pictures that covered the mantelpiece. When they reached Emma's preserved bedroom, Sophie gasped in wonder. The room was exactly as it had been 20 years ago. A toddler bed with pink sheets, toys arranged carefully on shelves, tiny clothes hanging in the closet. But it was the stuffed rabbit sitting on the pillow that made Sophie's eyes go wide. "Mama, it's Benny!" Sophie pointed to a well-worn stuffed rabbit identical to the one she slept with every night. Elena stared at the toy, and suddenly a memory surfaced, clear and sharp as a photograph. She was 3 years old, clutching that exact rabbit, crying because she couldn't find her brother. Someone was trying to comfort her, but all she wanted was Marcus, wanted him to read her a story and make everything better. "I remember," Elena whispered, sinking onto the little bed. "I remember this rabbit. I remember this room. I remember—" She looked up at Marcus with tears streaming down her face. "I remember you reading to me. You always did the voices for all the characters." Marcus sat down beside her on the tiny bed, and for a moment they were just siblings again, a big brother and little sister who had found their way back to each other. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of catching up, sharing stories, and slowly knitting together the threads of a family that had been torn apart by tragedy. Elena learned about her grandparents, who had died while she was in foster care, never knowing their granddaughter was alive. She saw videos of her first steps, heard stories about her favorite foods and songs, began to understand the person she had been before her world changed forever. Marcus took a month off work, the first extended vacation he had taken since starting his company. He spent the time helping Eleanor and Sophie settle into the house he bought for them in Indianapolis, close enough to their parents that Carol could see her granddaughter every day, but far enough away that Elena could establish her own life and routines. Elena enrolled in community college classes, something she had always dreamed of but never thought possible. Marcus insisted on paying for everything, education, housing, whatever they needed, but Eleanor was determined to build her own life, rather than simply accept charity from her wealthy brother. "I need to do this myself," she explained to him one evening as they watched Sophie play in the backyard. "I need to know that I can take care of us, that I'm more than just a victim who was rescued." Marcus understood, even though his instinct was to solve every problem with his checkbook. Instead, he helped her study, drove her to campus when her old car broke down, and babysat Sophie when Elena had to work late at the part-time job. She took to supplement her financial aid. Sophie started at a new school, where she quickly became the star of her reading group. Her teacher, Ms. Williams, was amazed by the 8-year-old's vocabulary and comprehension skills. "She reads like someone who has been loved and encouraged her whole life," Ms. Williams told Elena during their first parent-teacher conference. "She has been," Elena replied, thinking of all the evenings she had read to Sophie by lamplight in their old apartment, determined that her daughter would have every opportunity Eleanor herself had been denied. Carol threw herself into being a grandmother with the enthusiasm of someone making up for lost time. She taught Sophie how to bake cookies, took her shopping for new clothes, and spent hours in the backyard teaching her how to tend a garden. David, who visited every few weeks from Florida, became Sophie's partner in mischief, teaching her card games and taking her to baseball games. The transformation in Marcus was perhaps the most dramatic of all. His employees noticed that he smiled more, that he remembered their names and asked about their families. He delegated more responsibility and took actual vacations. The driven, solitary man who had built an empire from nothing discovered that the thing he had been working toward his entire life wasn't another acquisition or a bigger profit margin. It was this: Sunday afternoon barbecues in his backyard, helping Sophie with science fair projects, watching Elena discover who she was meant to be when she wasn't just surviving but thriving. The bracelet that had started it all remained Sophie's most treasured possession, but now she wore it alongside a new one that Marcus made for her, using the same pattern but with beads that spelled out family in colorful letters. Elena wore a matching bracelet, and even Carol had asked Marcus to make her one, wanting to feel connected to the chain of love that had somehow, miraculously, brought her daughter home. Roberto, who had made the trip from Chicago for Sophie's 9th birthday party, watched the celebration with satisfaction. "I told you that man was different," he said to Elena, as they watched Marcus push Sophie on the swing set he had installed in his backyard. "He has the heart of a father, not just the wallet of a rich man." On Sophie's 9th birthday, they gathered in the backyard of Marcus's house, 3 generations of Thompsons celebrating under the warm summer sun. Sophie blew out the candles on a cake that Carol had made using a recipe from Elena's childhood, and as she made her wish, she looked around at the faces of all the people who loved her. "What did you wish for, Misha?" Elena asked as they cleaned up wrapping paper and birthday plates. Sophie smiled mysteriously. "I can't tell you, or it won't come true. But I will say this. I wished for something that I think already happened. That evening, as the family gathered in the living room to watch Sophie's favorite movie, Eleanor felt Marcus touch her shoulder. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't been washing cars that night?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled, watching her daughter fall asleep in her grandfather David's lap while he read her a story. "I think we would have found each other eventually. Some connections are too strong to stay broken forever." Carol, who was sitting in her favorite chair knitting a sweater for Sophie, looked up from her needles. "I always knew this day would come," she said softly. "I could feel it in my bones the way mothers do. Emma was coming home and she was bringing our future with her." Elena looked around the room at her family, her real family, the people who had been waiting for her for 23 years, without even knowing if she was alive. The bracelet on her wrist caught the last light of the sunset streaming through the windows, each bead a reminder that love, once given, never really disappears. It just waits, patient and persistent, for the right moment to bring everyone home. As Sophie stirred in her grandfather's arms, mumbling something about Uncle Marcus and tomorrow's pancakes, Elena understood that she hadn't just found her family. She had found herself, the person she was always meant to be, a daughter, a sister, a mother surrounded by love. The lost little girl who had wandered alone in a parking lot 20 years ago had finally, miraculously, found her way back to where she belonged.